actually 3.5 years ago, my husband came home from work one day, and this was before I was working at the brewery, but he came home. I had children here at the house. All of my kids were here. We had a yard full of neighbors, and he was fixing the oven. He's not very skilled, when it comes to fixing stuff. And it was during Lent. And so he was fasting some things in his diet, and he had an accident fixing the oven. Well, at the time, we thought maybe he fainted because of he'd been fasting. We called EMS. They came out. And that one visit, was the catalyst for us discovering he had a mental illness. And it was about a 3-month process from that to diagnosis to 30 days in a rehab facility and him coming home. And we found out he had bipolar. And obviously, when you have something like that happen, you began to look at your whole life's history through the lens of bipolar mania. And because we had been in full-time ministry, vocational ministry, most of 20 years, all of his manic activity looked like just a lot of Christian activity.
Right.
So if he would get sad or depressed, he was just a workaholic. So he would add 2 more couples to do premarital counseling with, or he would do divorce care, or he would mentor 1 more student at the school, or he'd plan 1 more activity. And the list of activities that he could plan for kingdom growth, it never ended. And as his partner, I had been running at this frenetic pace for as long as I had known him. And I didn't have a mental illness, but I was trying really hard to catch up, or to at least match his pace. And so his diagnosis, gosh, I guess it was in 2018 now. No, it's 2017. That really began for me this huge season of feeling like God had really abandoned me. I was super angry. I was physically exhausted. We had been doing all of these things in the name of serving Christ and serving others and loving our neighbors, and it felt like it was all a lie. We were doing all these things because my husband had bipolar mania and he couldn't stop. And instead of channeling that mania into something destructive, he channeled it into productive kingdom work. Yeah. And God did use a lot of that, and still continues to use that. But initially, those first probably 6 months to a year, I was so angry because I felt like I didn't want to move to Rocky Mount. And that to me was like the final straw. We had left Dallas because Dad was on a mega high and thought we could plant this church and do all of these things. And I had been doing all of these things. And here we are, he has a mental illness. And everyone's really focused on him and his own health. Meanwhile, I am coming to the realization that our whole life it felt like all the things that we had done didn't matter. We'd just been spinning wheels, and I was exhausted for no good reason. And here we had planted 2 churches, and we had all these people in and out of our home. And I mean, I'm feeding all the neighbors, and this is very hard for me. Yeah. I stopped writing during that time because I didn't trust myself to not tell the whole truth about what was going on under the undercurrent of my emotions, my frustration with God, with Dad. And so I just didn't write. I posted on Instagram whenever I did write, but I quit blogging. I deleted my blog. I mean, like, years of writing are just, it's gone. And I really wrestled with feeling abandoned. Like, I felt like my whole marriage had been about Thad and what he could do for the Lord. And now he had this illness, and now the rest of our life was going to be focused on making sure he stayed really healthy, you know? Mm-hmm. And we weren't being released from the things that we were currently doing. So it was hard. It was very hard.
Yeah. Did you feel abandoned by Thad or by God, or like when you say I felt abandoned, what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I felt abandoned by God.
Yeah.
I felt like he'd given me to Thad in some way, and I had helped support him and run alongside of him and serve him as he continued to, we joke now, like make crazy, but looking back, the reason we were spinning all these plates was it wasn't humanly possible. And people attributed that to the Holy Spirit, and I'm like, no, he's got bipolar mania, and it reframed it. Not that God didn't use it, but it was still very, very difficult. And I felt abandoned by the church. And I don't mean just my individual church, but the larger church, because we don't talk about mental illness a lot in ministry. We're talking about it more than we used to. But I felt like the church didn't want me to say, it's kind of like, well, just communicate that that's tired, and he's just going to take a sabbatical, and you guys go away and get fixed and then come back. Mm-hmm. And we did take a sabbatical for about 9 months, partly because Thad was still trying to learn to walk again. When he had the accident in the kitchen, he ended up with conversion disorder, which meant that his brain just shut the rest of his body down. And so he couldn't walk, he couldn't use the bathroom on his own. For a little while there, he slurred his speech. It was just the body's response to trauma, like a lifetime of just trauma. And it manifested itself in this illness. And so it was a long haul.
Yeah.
Like a long physical haul of how do we get healthy? What does health look like? And who do we need around us who will help us get healthy? And then hold us accountable to staying healthy. We saw a marriage counselor during that time. And so when I say I felt abandoned, I mainly felt abandoned by God and the church. I never felt abandoned by Thad, partly because he really needed me. Mm-hmm. And looking back on our 20 years of marriage now, he's always really needed me. I just didn't understand why. Mm-hmm. I do now, but at the time I didn't.
Did you resent that?
Oh, yeah.
That he needed you so much?
Super resentful. Oh, yeah. I was full of bitterness, resentment, and because he was a pastor figure, I couldn't tell anybody, really. I mean, who do you tell except my own therapist that this is how I'm feeling towards my husband who's visibly ill, mm-hmm. Without feeling some guilt. And so then I felt guilty. I felt shame. I felt a lot of things.
Yeah.
I felt a lot of things.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought this up because I think, as you said, we are starting to talk about mental illness a little bit more. But usually the conversation is around the person experiencing mental illness, accessing the help they need, which is so important.
Right.
But we don't often talk about what it's like to live in close proximity with someone that's really suffering, because mm-hmm. we want to honor our loved one and we want to protect them. And, mm-hmm. I can imagine some of the extra layers on top of that being a quote unquote, a pastor's wife.
Yeah. And being public with having written so authentically in the past of just the struggles of planting a church, learning to live in a predominantly African-American community and figuring out the race piece of that and owning my own sin and racism. And so it had been a whole series of a lot of learning. And then it was like this too. And it felt like this huge blow from God. To why did you allow all of these years to go on like you did and then illuminate the illness now? Why now? He's had it since he was in college. There were signs then, but we didn't know because we didn't know he had a family history of mental illness. But why now? Because he could have saved me a lot of grief, a lot of heartache, a lot of long years of feeling misunderstood or even feeling unloved. I mean, there were lots of periods of time in my marriage I felt unloved because Dad was so focused on serving the Lord in some capacity that he was unavailable as a father, as a husband. But everything he did kind of turned to gold. I mean, he was very gifted. He was a gifted speaker. He was a gifted leader. And I just couldn't figure out how the heck we ended up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, planting
Right.
a church that failed, planting another church that at that time was still struggling. It was a baby. And now we have a mental illness,
And
and we're
it's,
living in a place where it's hard to get help, you know?
yeah. Oh, and I'm just listening to you too, thinking how culturally we so celebrate production and achievement and
Mm-hmm.
success. And then he's a man, which has got that extra
Yeah,
sort of level of like, I am man, watch me change the world kind of thing. And then you've got the Christian layer. Like that's a lot of layers
a
there
lot.
for you. Did you ever just, and okay, I want to say this too. I want to hold your story tenderly because I realize that it's fresh. Like this is fresh.
Yeah.
This is not ancient history. So, but I do want to ask, did you ever want to walk away? Did you want to walk away from, the marriage or from God or from the church? There's layers of stuff here. Did it ever just feel like this is too much? I can't do this.
Oh, yeah. I think initially I wanted to take my entire family and put them on an RV and just drive away into the sunset. The whole family, meaning dad and the kids. But then after he came home and I began to live with it and process it, and we were in marriage counseling, I thought, I want out. I want out of all of this. It's unfair, unjust. Um, so, you want to pause?
I do. I'm sorry. And yeah. So, and did you ever just want to walk away?
Absolutely. Initially, I wanted to take Thad and all the kids on an RV and just leave the city, leave the state, and just travel because I wanted that close family time that we had not had in all the years prior. And then after Thad got home and I began to live with the effects of the bipolar and really spend time with him and talk with him and do marriage counseling and then look at the messiness of the church. And I wanted out of all of it. Um, Predominantly the marriage because I felt like this was never going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the first few years of our marriage, I kept thinking, well, if Thad does this next thing, then he'll have time for me. If he takes this next job at this next church, he'll be satisfied and then he'll have time for me.
Right.
And it was then he'll finish seminary and he'll have time for me. We'll get this church planted and he'll have time for me. Um, and it was like a sobering thought of this is it. Like I'm 40, almost 43 now, but I thought I've given him the best years of my life. Like the best years. I gave him my youth. We got married super young. We had a bunch of kids young. He had the best part of me and he didn't even notice. And was super angry about that. And then I thought, now got to live with this going forward. And do I want to do that? How much more is it going to cost me? How much more is God going to ask me to sacrifice or lay down or live without? And it just didn't seem fair. It just didn't seem fair. I felt like I had done enough.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I wanted out. I wanted out of the ministry too. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think anyone that goes through difficulty, suffering, trials, like, of course we want out, like that's normal human
Yeah.
response. But to me, there is something about being in vocational ministry that you kind of have this extra layer of like, I've given you this. And we don't want to admit
Mm-hmm.
it intellectually because we don't ever want to
Yeah.
admit that we look at God as being transactional because we know he's not, but there can be just that thing of like, I've given you so much, like, and this is what I'm left with. I know that my
Yeah.
husband and I have had moments like this. My husband will talk about it specifically. He's really had moments. We've experienced 4 miscarriages at different points in pregnancy, and so, and a whole slew of other things as well. But there have definitely been moments where, and he'd be okay with me saying this, but out of his mouth, he has gone, I have given you my whole life. we don't own a house, we don't own this and
Yeah.
that, like everyone around us does, you know, we kind of
Yes.
start listing off the sacrifices and then going, and this is it, like, this is what I'm left with. And I know that there's been just these moments of real, you know, entitlement, like if we're really honest, like entitlement. And where all of our kind of sin is exposed before the Lord. And yet on a rational level, you can go, well, that makes sense. It makes sense that you're responding that way, you know. For you, Lori, like why, I mean, you haven't walked away from Thad, you're still married. Your family's still together. Like, what did you learn in this season that actually helped you to endure through it? What, you know, can you give us, what's the 3-step process? Like, no, just kidding.
Oh gosh. I think the biggest thing is I just like him. You know, I like him as a person. He's the kindest, most honest. He's full of integrity. He's got good character. He's kind. He's a good dad. But I think too, it honestly boiled down to, we have a history. That's like 23 years together. That's a long time. And I didn't want the baggage of starting over with someone else. And then what do you do with the stuff? And what do you do with the kids? And as harsh as that sounds to say that, in the moment, I rationalized myself out of even thinking about divorce, because ultimately I didn't want that. But I felt so boxed in and crushed that I wanted to explode. And I didn't see any other way out, and I didn't quite see a way through it. So yeah.
What kept you from not walking away from your faith? I mean, what, you know, it's one thing to have your husband and go, I still love him, and there's enough reasons for me to stay, you know, and that's beautiful. I want to affirm that. But what about your faith, you know, when none of this has panned out the way you thought you would? You've given your life, you've given, as you said, 20 years, you know, your best years of serving others because of your love for the Lord. What is that? Do you feel that was in vain, or how do you stick around when this is kind of what you're left with?
I don't know how my faith remained, except that Christ is faithful when we're not. And I felt like he was always wooing me in different ways. When I was at my worst, I always felt like he was present. In a more physical sense, if that makes sense, where I felt abandoned in all other ways, I always felt he was present with me. And there's really no way to explain that except that he was, and I knew it. He just hadn't shown up in the ways that I wanted him to. And he hadn't done for me in my life how I thought he should have. He didn't give me the things that I wanted in the way that I wanted them. But he was always there. And so when I think about Lament, just as an offering, I didn't know a lot about Lament until this last 3 years, when it's all I could do. But it wasn't just a one prayer every day. It was like a constant conversation that never ended, with how angry I was and how upset I was and how I expected God to fix this. I didn't ask for this. We had done X, Y, and Z. We had given it all, and he had a responsibility to come through. And that conversation never went away, but over the years, the tone of my voice shifted. The things that I was most angry about changed, and it became almost like a comfort level conversation of, okay, God, this is how it is. And I don't like it, but I'm coming to terms with it. And so if this is how life is going to be, based upon the life that we've had, then you've got to help me learn to live in it. And during that